So you will discover as I talk that I have nasty cough. So I thought I will not start a new topic today and talk a little bit about the model that goes into the third coursework, which builds a little bit on the machine learning course that some of you have done. So you'd have had an email from me yesterday. Yes. So if you have done a machine learning course, then you should be able to do this now. So I will randomly pick people I recognize from the machine learning course. As I talk, I will pause and they will continue. Okay? How many of you have not done the machine learning course? Okay, yes. So there's only a small number of people who will help me teach. Okay, that's good. So what I think next year I'll make it, what's it called, prerequisite. Make my life easy. Okay, so the main thing that I need to talk about is the notation that I use here in specifying the coursework, and this long equation that is in the paper of Hutchinson, where it comes from and what the free parameters are and how we are going to learn it from data. Okay, so we have seen a couple of different ways of pricing options. We have seen that it's a complex nonlinear relationship, and if we make certain assumptions about the dynamics of the time series, then we can derive a closed form solution. That's the Black-Scholes model. We have also seen that we can do the same thing in a simulation environment, where we simulate from that assumed model and then look to see what the distribution is at the time of maturity, work out what the payback is, and then work backwards to price an option here so that there is no systematic arbitrage difference, systematic arbitrage opportunity. What these guys show in this paper is that if you actually leave all that aside and took data from the markets at which options are being traded, then the relationship between the underlying asset's price and the time to maturity, based on that, you can learn a nonlinear regression model that approximates the options price quite well. Okay, so you can take a small window of data, learn a mapping, and test it on unseen data, and it looks quite cool. Okay. What's more, they also say that you can, if you did it with this particular type of model called radial basis functions, this is a model you can differentiate quite easily. And when you differentiate it, what you get is the hedging ratio that we saw. We saw when we derived the Black-Scholes, if we sold an option and held on to an asset whose value is the derivative of the option price with respect to the stock price, which is our delta, then you cancel out the stochastic part. This is the fundamental thing that we observe. Okay? So these guys would train up a data-driven model which looks like this, and from this evaluate the hedge ratio, or the delta, and show that it's a quite cool approximation comes out. Okay? So your job is to just implement this and see if this is actually true. So they make this claim, but let's see if this is true. Okay? So what are the things that we need to understand what they're doing? The first thing we want to start from is it's a nonlinear model. So keep in your mind the following picture that you have all done at some point in your life, that somebody gives you some data and asks you to fit a line through this. We have all done this, right? Regression. You make some measurements and then you fit a straight line. Okay. So these are the, say, x's, and at every x I have a corresponding y. And the model that I fit, I'm going to say is y equals mx plus c. Yeah. How do I fit this model? I put a line here and then say at every point xi, what's the error I make? The error I make is this one, this one, this one, that one. And I would sum the error, which is yi minus mxi plus c squared, I equals 1 to, let's say there are n points. Yeah. And you can all work out, we have now done enough algebra and calculus that if I give you this as an error and told you what value of m and what value of c would minimize this error, yeah, then you know how to do this. Yeah, you will differentiate this expression with respect to m, set it to 0, differentiate it with respect to c, set it to 0. You can immediately imagine there are two equations and there are only two unknowns. And if you have two equations, two unknowns, you can solve it. Yeah, so that's the basic, simplest regression that we have done. When you were children, instead of differentiating this, what did you do? You took a foot ruler and then put it around like this, moved it around, and then you found a little line, drew that, and then computed the slope and the intercept. Yeah? The slope and the intercept are the two free parameters. XY pairs are the data. Okay? That much is very, very clear and well known to all of us. I can write precisely the same thing in the following form. If I wrote that, I drew that, and then I drew that. Okay? Those are going to be matrices and vectors. I stick here my x1, x2 up to xn, and then I put a 1 here, and then I put an m here, a c here, and I put y1, y2 up to yn. Yeah. What I'm doing is I'm writing precisely the problem that you solved here, which is the problem you solved with the foot ruler here, in a matrix form. Yeah. I'm saying I have a data matrix. My data is sitting here. My parameters are sitting here. And my output or target is sitting there. Okay? You should be able to immediately see that this is a, what's this, n by 2 matrix. That's a 2 by 1 vector. So when you multiply, you get n by 1. And that product is at every point what your model gives you. This one is what it should be. Yeah? So if I wrote this one as my job is to minimize, so let me call this one what? A matrix X. Let me call this some theta. Let me call this some Y. So minimizing X theta minus Y, yeah, is simply a matrix way of writing precisely that. Okay? You are persuaded of this. Okay, we'll come back to this. I'm doing this with a hidden agenda. Okay? And what this is linear regression. There's nothing else here. Yeah? It's linear. It's a regression because it's a graph that best fits that data. Okay, so let's say that we know. Of course, life is not always linear. You will end up with data that is non-linear. Yeah. So in the experiment you might have done, maybe you have got graphs to get points like that. If you try to fit the best linear line, and you go like that, that's not a very good idea. You might want to have a non-linear interpolation. Yeah? So you can go from linear to more and more sophisticated models. Yeah? And such a sophisticated model is a neural net. Yeah? Someone defines a particular nonlinear structure which is capable of fitting more complex data than data of this type. Okay? People construct this, and we won't go into this, but this paper talks about it, by saying I'm going to take my X data, which is the input that comes in, and construct many hidden units and have an output unit. Output, hidden, input. That's the domain into which this particular paper falls. Yeah. I can say, here I said my output is a linear function of the input. In this world, what we do is we take many hidden units. Each one has an output, which is a nonlinear function of the input. Yeah. And it's layered. There is a hidden layer, there is an output layer, there is some input layer. So each one of these hidden units has an output, which is a nonlinear function of what's coming in here. Okay? And these functions, a nonlinear function of those, is used to compute output. Okay? So if we define an architecture like this, and we define for ourselves what these nonlinear functions are, and interpret these links as carrying weights, so we call this Wij. Yeah. Then through the x, y, xi, yi data set that you have given me, I can ask the question, can I fit this nonlinear model? Okay? And when you're going to do that, your mental picture should grow a little bit from this one. In this one, I have used a single input variable and a linear model. In this picture, I've gone to a single input variable and a nonlinear model. Yeah? What I'm writing here is a single output variable, two input variables, and an arbitrary nonlinear model. An arbitrary nonlinear model with two input variables will look like a surface. Yeah? And depending on what values I put in here, and depending on what nonlinear function I take here, the shape of that surface will vary. Okay? For a particular choice of these functions, and for a particular choice of these values you put in, you probably will end up with that kind of a picture. That's a nonlinear surface. You can see it's not straight. Yeah, it's looking linear in this part at high values of these. Over here, it's kind of sharply curved. Yeah, and what sort of shape comes here is determined by two things. One is how much flexibility I allow into the functions that I define, and what the data tells me. Yeah, and we had this in this picture. If the data is all in a curve, and I force myself to fit a linear line, I will not be fitting that data well. Yeah, if I have restricted myself to a linear line, that's the best I can handle. On the other hand, in this picture, if I choose to apply a model that has huge amount of flexibility, say a polynomial of order 25, then my model is going to fit all the data correctly. I will get a model that fits every single data point. Okay? So it's striking a balance between that is an art in trying to model more complex data than applying a linear model. Okay? What this paper talks about, so that's the setting, okay? Let's start with that setting. In that setting, what this paper talks about is having a model with inputs, with hidden units, say, let's connect it like that. Am I missing one line? This goes to 2, this goes to 2. Yeah, each one gets 2, this one gets 2. Okay. And some output here. Let's construct a model like this, which has two inputs. And these two inputs are going to be the time to maturity of an option and the actual value of the option at any point in time scaled by the strike price of it. Okay? And then they are asking the question, what sort of model can I define here and what might the parameters be so that this is able to generate the call option price also normalized? Yeah, so that's the question they're asking. In doing that, they have chosen a very particular type of model And that particular type of model has this nonlinear part fixed in some way, fixed in a closed form way. Okay? And the parameters of the linear part over here, linear part, estimated. So it is kind of it is a model that's a halfway house between a linear model and a fully nonlinear model. Okay? It comes from the fact that if you make a model like what I have drawn there, with lots of nonlinearities, then estimating parameters of all those weights is a very complex job. You can only do this by gradient descent type methods, and those gradient descent type methods are known to get stuck in local minima. It is known that the computational time to train models like that is very high. There are all sorts of reasons. So because of those reasons, there is a halfway house type model, and that's the model that we are going to use. And in that particular halfway house type model, there is a nonlinear part that is kind of fixed. I'm saying kind of fixed because it is also learned from data, but it's learned in a closed form way rather than iterative gradient descent way. And there is a part that is estimated, and that part that's estimated also comes as a closed form solution, and that closed form solution is very similar to how you would solve that. Is that clear as a story? Yeah, you need that concept in your mind so that we can very quickly look at the equations and see where that fits in on this. Yeah, there is a linear model, we know how to solve it. We can write it in matrix form. And if we wrote it in matrix form, that's the way to minimize it. And the actual algorithm for minimizing this is very simple. So theta hat, and this I'm going to say, just take my word for it. Okay, I've looked it up in a book, so I'm going to get it right. It's x transpose x inverse x transpose y. And this will give precisely the same solution that you will get if you solve that system by differentiating, equating to zero, solve two equations into unknowns. Okay? Life is even easier if you get to this point. In MATLAB, you can solve for theta as x backslash y. That's all you do. Okay? All that is happening here is a error between a linear system and the target. What value of these weightings would minimize that error? And the thing that minimizes that error comes out in just one small line of code. Okay? This bit is not in the question paper, so you want to think about this a little bit. The backslash operator solves this problem for you instantly. Okay? So let's now put into this what's going on here. Now, let's look at their model. The model that they have written out after they have trained on data looks like this. It's running into this very badly typeset. It has something, 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 and something, and something else. Yeah? You with me? Is it readable from there, or should I make it big? Yeah. Okay. So let's look at each of these terms one at a time. There's one term, two terms, three terms under square root. There is the fourth term under a square root, and there is a linear term. This is the way to look at this. The last line here tells you my final model has a linear term. Why is it a linear term? It is some number times one of the inputs, correct? Plus some number times the other input, because the inputs are s over x and t minus t, plus an offset. Yeah? So in the last line, you should see something very similar to y equals mx plus c, but for two variables. Yeah? Imagine you are fitting a plane in 2 dimensions. Yeah? The equation equivalent to y equals mx plus c would be y equals m1x1 plus m2x2 plus c. Yeah, with me? That imagination should be there. And that is precisely what this last line is. So there is a linear part to this model. Okay? Plus, there is going to be some nonlinear parts. And those nonlinear parts are the stuff that's sitting here. And you will immediately agree that square root is a nonlinear thing. Yeah? Anyone disagree with this? Okay, so it's actually cheating in discussions to post something idiotic and then say, do you disagree with this? And of course you won't, and immediately kind of implying that everything else I'm going to say you will agree with. So that's not good. And so there's a nonlinear function, okay? Nonlinear function of the two variables that we are interested in. The two variables we are interested in is s over x and t minus t. Yeah? And what is he doing in this nonlinear part? You're taking this input, subtracting from this input something, yeah? And if you treat this as a vector minus some numbers, this remains a vector. Multiplying this by a matrix, which is right here, and then multiplying by the same thing. Yeah, do you see that? So this expression that they have written here is of the form x transpose AX of a vector x. Yeah? Well, or to be more precise, oops, I could write that one is of the form x minus some m transpose some matrix x minus n. You want to appreciate this structure under that square root. Yeah, that's the starting point. There is this structure hidden under that square root. With me? Okay. So if you accept that, then you will see that there is a, where have I gone? There is a model which has a nonlinear part, which is many of these guys. Yeah? There are only 4 in this model, not as many as I have drawn there. And each nonlinearity is of this form. Okay? So, and then you take the square root, so, okay, that's the nonlinear function. It's multiplied by some number. Okay? Go up there. There are 3 more such terms. Each one is take your data vector, subtract something, form the quadratic form of the x transpose AX type, take the square root, weight it by something, add it up. So that's the model. So you're going to see 4 nonlinear terms and a linear term. That whole thing has weights attached to them. The weighted sum of all that is my prediction of what the option price is going to be. Okay? And the learning job of learning from the data is, what are these numbers? Where did they come from? Yeah, that's the part. And that's the tricky part. Okay? So what is special about the structure that they have chosen is that they're trying to fit local densities through the data. So once you generate some data, there is an input data x, that data is distributed in some way, and what they're saying is I'm going to fit a local density to this data and look at how that data is distributed. Okay? And that takes you to, should I say this or should I not? No, maybe I should say this. It takes you to a domain of a class of models known as mixture Gaussian models. Yeah. You don't necessarily need to go go into this. I just want to mention it just for you to get an idea that this relates to something else. Okay? To actually do the task, to estimate the parameters, we don't need this. Yeah? But you will fit a function that's based on this. Therefore, we want to know this. So what this does is, now you know univariate Gaussian. All of us know. One variable, Gaussian distribution. Everything is centered around the mean, distributed in some way, univariate Gaussian. You know, and we have done this, multivariate Gaussian. Yeah? I can only draw 2 dimensions, but you can imagine much higher dimensions. So this is a single multivariate Gaussian. A mixture Gaussian in multi-dimensions might be a combination of data which has more than one component. So that's a mixture Gaussian in multi-dimensions. A mixture Gaussian in one dimension is 2 modes. Okay? So if I went and, I don't know, so collected your machine learning marks or your computational finance marks, usually, normally, one would expect a distribution like that. But if it turns out that many of you sleep late at night, and some of you drink a lot of alcohol, then your mark distribution may look like that. There's a mode here and a mode here. These are possibilities. So someone with the tools to model data, usually in elementary statistics, is almost always stuck with that one. They're always worried about the mean and the standard deviation, and then we stop there. But underlying data can be more complex. And when that happens, we need more powerful machinery. Okay. So it turns out that when we look at this model, the distribution of in the space of the underlying asset price and time to maturity, they seem to think is not Gaussian distributed. It's in clusters. It's in groups here and there. Okay? And those clusters and the groups here and there might have local structures. And those local structures are what I'm trying to draw like this. Okay? So now let's go back. Let's start. Oops, go away. If we took a lot of data of the existing options and the underlying asset, S over X here, T minus T here, and plot a scatter of all that data. Yeah, so that data is going to look like this. All the data that you have is all over the place. Okay? And I can go and look at this data and say, how is this distributed? And I recognize this data is distributed into 4 kind of clusters. And in different parts of these 4 clusters, locally, data is correlated in different ways. Yeah, so that's what I've kind of drawn to you. The nonlinear part of this model pulls that out. Yeah. The nonlinear part of this model says, I can pull out these local structures, and in these local areas, there is different kinds of correlation, okay, which is what we pull out. And this you will immediately recognize if you look at the structure of the equation. The square root under the square root is a structure like that. Yeah, and this structure you will know because you have seen this in when you did the first task of portfolio optimization. We talked about the multivariate Gaussian density. We talked about correlated structures, anti-correlated structures of multivariate Gaussian density, and we wrote the equation of the multivariate Gaussian. Yeah? If you go and look up the equation of the multivariate Gaussian, you will see this expression. Just the same way, a single univariate Gaussian is about how far you are from the mean. That's the variance. In the multivariate Gaussian, there's a matrix sitting there telling you how it's distributed locally, what's the correlation structure locally is. Yeah. So given the data, shift by the mean, multiply by a measure of how things are spread, multiply again to square, is the structure of a Gaussian distribution. Yeah? This we can do in an environment like this, where data is distributed like this. Okay? Let me come back to this just one more time. The data given to me in the space of t minus t s over x, yeah, happens to have this structure. So these are all the points that I have collected. Yeah? This is the data sitting there. At each of these points, I know what the corresponding options price is. Yeah? And I know there is no data here. So a suitable model that I can derive for this would first capture how this data is distributed, and then calculate the weights on those functions to predict the option price. And that's what's going on. Okay. So I can capture how this is distributed by fitting this mixture Gaussian model. And in this mixture Gaussian model, what are the things I need to pull out? I need to pull out all these local centers, so which is something that's sitting here, sitting here, sitting here, sitting here. And I need to pull out how things are locally correlated. Okay, and the local correlations are this one, that one, that one. Okay? Now we should be able to map this picture in our minds to that equation. So part of that equation there is hidden in this picture. And this you have to be able to see. In terms of precisely what you do is set up the data, and I have given you a program that when run will pull out the means and the variances here. It's done by fitting a mixture Gaussian model. And when you fit a mixture Gaussian model, you pull out where these local means are, and you pull out what the local covariance structures are. Yeah, it's one line of code. If you read the help of that line of code and understand what it returns, you will have the answer. Okay, but it's important to visualize what this is doing. Yeah. We don't want to build a nonlinear model which thinks data is sitting here when data is actually sitting here. But in this data, it's not just sitting here in some arbitrary way, but with a particular structure. Okay? You can go a little bit more than that and think about this and say, oh yeah, what would happen to this data if I fit just one model, one mode Gaussian? Yeah. A single mode Gaussian would put, just by looking at this, the mean here, and think data is distributed like that. Yeah, it loses the local structures that are there. Okay? But if there are 100 data points, I'm also free to try and fit 100 mode Gaussian. Yeah? And if my algorithm runs correctly, it'll pick every single point as a mean, yeah, and put something around that. Yeah?
How does it know how many Gaussians it should be?
Right. So this is a problem that has no correct answer. Yeah, because you can interpret. I mean, it's like clustering. How many clusters are there? Yeah. It always depends on the scale at which you are looking at and what your idea of distance between points are. Yeah. So if you're distributed like this, I could take a look from here and say there seem to be two clusters. There's some clusters here, some cluster there, and a few isolated people. Yeah. But if I look at this class from, I don't know, from Mars or somewhere, yeah, this is just one cluster for me, yeah, just a little blob. But if I've got a little ant moving around, then everybody's a cluster. Yeah, so it's what's in your mind about the distance between points is what defines what clustering is. Yeah? There are some formal statistical ways of saying that, let me cluster this group, but let me say, let's try one cluster, two clusters, three clusters, four clusters, and so on. the straightforward how well the clusters approximate the data will always favor very large number of clusters. Yeah? If I make all of you clusters, then I'm representing you perfectly. Okay? So the way to do this would be to cluster, look at the error that you make in representing you by those clusters, and penalize that error by the number of clusters. Okay? So then you go straight back into other things we have done. We fit data, we have a penalty function to penalize, and that penalty function induces, that penalizing induces, some desirable property. So I might say, okay, let's just cluster these people. Every cluster center, the cost of clustering would be the distance between the cluster center and you. Yeah, so if I put a cluster center here, then with each one I associate with that cluster center, I can compute a distance. Next cluster center says here, each one I associate with this, I can make a distance measure. But then I have put two. If I put a third cluster, that will go and sit there, and those guys will be close to that. Yeah? So then I can ask, oh, if I keep doing this, I will end up with as many clusters as people are, and this approximation error would be 0 at that point. So what would I do? I would say the approximation error plus some tuning constant times the number of clusters that I choose as an objective. So the objective will be a balance between fitting the data and some prior I might have about how many clusters might be here. Okay, does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so when it comes to this one, now I think I'm nearly done here. In the data sheet or in the lab sheet, I have described this model that they have used in this form. And in this form, there are J basis functions, J functions, and those J functions, J is 4. Yeah. These 5 J's are each of them the term sitting under the square root. Yeah. Which is what I have described in this way. I wrote up there. Take away the mean, multiply by some local covariance matrix, and multiply by A. In the model that they have used, they use an offset term here. Yeah? If you do that, then training for that is a nonlinear problem. They don't exactly say in the paper how they train for it. So what we will do is we'll go for the easy option of not worrying about it. Okay, so this Bj is going to be 0 in our model. Okay. There is a MATLAB function that will help you fit this Gaussian mixture model. It will pull out these m's and the sigmas. So if you run this model on this program for the data, what you would expect to pull out are these 1.35, 0.45, this matrix 1.35, 0.45. Okay? So these means and local covariances will come from running this program. Once you have done that, you have to now know that the nonlinear part has been learned from the data in just one shot. What has to be then learned is the weights of each of those nonlinear parts and the linear part in the model. Okay? Is everyone happy that if you were to run this model here, this program here, what we have worked out are the numbers inside the square roots? Okay? So as soon as then you give me the data, S over X and T minus T, I can compute everything that's inside the data because this program has given me these numbers. The remaining parameters are the minus 0.06, minus 0.03, 0.03, those ones. And these guys correspond to the lambdas here, the W here, and the W naught here. Okay? Now comes the one and only step that we need. And then where do we go from there? So we have in this model the S over X and T minus T going in. We have in this model 4 basis functions, 3, 4. Oops. All right. Okay. Each of these basis functions here will output square root of something, square root of something, square root of something, square root of something. Okay. And then these guys are weighted by some lambda 1, lambda 2, lambda 3, lambda 4. And I'm going to add to that the linear part. So the linear part would be this S over X times some W1, T minus T times some W2. And then I'm going to add another offset to that, which is similar to the Y equals Mx plus C. I'll call it W naught. So if there's one thing you want to take away from this after I go, is what's this picture. I have this as data. I have analyzed the distribution of the data in the input space and worked out what these local means and covariances are. And because I know that, given this data, I can compute the first term coming through the square root, second term coming through the square root, third term coming through the square root, fourth term coming through the square root. Okay? Plus, I have a linear function, plus I have an offset. This is what I started talking about initially. Okay? So the question then is, by how much should I weight this, how much should I weight this, how much is this, how much is this, how much is this, how much is this, so that at output I get a good approximation to the call option. Okay? The clever bit now is to see a relationship between this one and this one I started with, that matrix. This is exactly happening here. You gave me the data. I organized the data in a form that this much is the data. There are weights associated with this data, weights by which I'm going to multiply this in order to give me the output. That's what this is. Yeah? I will do exactly the same thing here. I will build a matrix like that. And this matrix will have as many data items as I have to fit. Yeah? Everything here is going to be a 1 in the last column. Yeah? The term here is going to be T minus T. The term here is going to be S over X. And there will be 4 other terms. 1, 2, 3, 4. And each one of them would be the square root that's coming from there. This will be the square root coming from here, and so on. And this is what I refer in the lab sheet as a design matrix. It's a statistical term which in this parameter estimation set. What would be the equivalent of this one? It would be the call option prices. Normalized. Yeah. What would be the unknown parameters that I'm going to estimate? There will be the lambda 1, lambda 2, and over here the W naught. It's a little bit tricky to get your head around it, but the clever bit is to map what are we trying to achieve through this model. We want to set up some data, learn an interpolation function. And that interpolation function has a particular structure in the paper. So we just take it. Yeah? And that particular structure has some nonlinear components and a linear component. The linear component is on this one, the variable and an offset. The nonlinear components are coming from terms like square root of something, square root of x transpose A, x times something. Okay? And we know how to calculate that. We have the tools to do that. So the process that we will go through in doing this is to set up some data guys tell you how they did this, is to fit the mixture Gaussian model construct this matrix, design matrix, and then solve. Solve for and so on. Yeah, does it make sense? Yeah. Stay with this. I mean, it's a little bit tricky, but it's not, it's doable. Think this picture all the time, that picture. Relate the model, what's inside the square root, to this expression. And this expression is part of the multivariate Gaussian we have seen many times before. Yeah? And if we have learned the m's and sigmas by a program that's sitting there out there, then we know what the basis functions are. And once we know what the basis functions are, what we need to calculate are the weights. And the weights are calculated in just one line of code. But what we need to do is to construct the matrix that goes into this one line of code. Yeah, that's pretty big. And that matrix will be as many data items you have times 7. Of the 7, 4 are the nonlinear basis functions, 2 are the linear part, and an offset. For the offset, I have a 1. Does that make sense? Any questions? Yeah.
For the covariance from
Yeah.
the document,
Yeah.
they are all constant
The
for the 4 nonlinear terms.
In this model,
Exactly.
is that what they've done? Okay, so they have frozen them to be the same,
Correct.
to make life easy.
Anyway, because I was guessing different.
Yeah, so in the paper they might explain why they did that, they might justify it. Yeah, they might have, I mean, in these things, when you apply such models, there is always a fundamental compromise between the amount of data you actually have and the number of parameters you're trying to estimate from that data. Okay, so you never want to estimate more parameters than you have data. Yeah. So what happens when you try to estimate covariance matrices is that if you have 10-dimensional data, the covariance matrix has 10 squared is 100 by 2, 50 parameters roughly. Exactly 50 parameters, yeah. Why by 2? Because it will be symmetric, yes, correct. Yeah. So whenever you estimate covariance matrices, you're blowing up the number of parameters. So these guys might have decided, let's not fit this mixture Gaussian model and work out the 4 covariance matrices. Let's just fit 1. Yeah, then they will talk about it in the paper. But I think when you do what are they doing? They're simulating data from Black-Scholes and approximating it with this model. Yeah. So there is no real limit to how much data you can simulate. Yeah, so you need not restrict to this. Yeah, any other question? Quick question? Yeah.
By the time we divide into a training set and a test set, I think there's this tendency that after a while the model begins to mess up. Like after 30 days, we wide it, then after 30 days.
Right. So yeah. So this is it's a point that you have to bear in mind always, that if you learn a model from a training set and apply it to an unseen model, you are making the underlying assumption both come from the same statistical distribution. Yeah. So if you guys are sitting here and then I want to learn something about how much marks you will get in some exam from some people, apply it to the others, I can assume that this is a homogeneous, uniform, stationary population. Yeah. But if I learn from your first year performance and try to predict your 4th year performance, I might go wrong because your functional relationship might have changed over time. And in the coursework and in some places, wherever you deal with time series data, you have to be aware of that.
Yeah, so arguments now doing recursive.
Sorry?
Are we meant to do the training recursively, like keep shift, like a sliding window or something?
In this one, no. In this one, just do one bash. Yeah. Okay. So I'll talk a little bit about this on Monday as well. So try and lose your weekend and learn.